Welcome back, everyone. This is the third video for Chapter 6. We've covered habituation, we've covered classical conditioning. Now it's time to move on to operant conditioning. Now, with classical conditioning, you have reflexive responses that are connected to a previously neutral stimulus. But with operant conditioning, what you're doing is you are acting on voluntary responses. And if you see a behavior that you like, you reward it, so it happens again. And if you see a behavior you dislike, you punish it so it does not happen again. Let's unpack how. Just a basic definition for operant conditioning. This is sometimes called instrumental conditioning. This is just the process of changing behavior by providing a reinforcement after some response has occurred. Now, operant conditioning is different than classical conditioning in a really important way. Subjects behave, with operant conditioning, the subject's behavior is going to induce some kind of outcome, and that is then going to influence future behavior. So in other words, you do a good behavior, and then you receive a reward for it. And what you're rewarding here is this voluntary muscle movement or voluntary behavior that they have performed. This is completely under the participant's control. But with classical conditioning, all we're doing is we're affecting the subject's natural neurological responses. These are reflexive behaviors that someone does not have control over. Things like our visceral responses like salivation and digestion. So the biggest difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning is this. Operant conditioning acts on voluntary behaviors. Classical conditioning acts on involuntary behaviors. So you really don't have much control over a classically conditioned behavior, but you can pretty easily modify behaviors that have been operant. Now, in operant conditioning, we're going to use a couple really important terms, and the first one is reinforcement, and I've already mentioned this a little bit already. Reinforcement is just the process of increasing the future probability of the most recent response. So the last thing that some organism has done when you receive a reward, it's that most recent behavior that suddenly increases in the likelihood of occurring again. Now you gotta be careful with this and keep this in mind. So if you're, for instance, trying to train your kid to pick up their room more often, and your kid picks up the room but then goes and does something else like draw on the wall for a little while, and you give them a reward like a cookie, or you give them their allowance or something like that, what's going to happen is you have reinforced the most recent behavior. And if the last thing that they did was drawing on the wall, then that means they're going to think, hey, gee, you know what? If I draw on the wall after getting my allowance, that's, sorry, I screwed that up. I draw on the wall, and look, what happens afterwards is I get my allowance. That means I'm going to draw on the wall much more frequently. Now, the reason this is an important distinction to make is because when you're dealing with really young kids, when you use operant conditioning or animals, they don't do a good job of making logical inferences or listening to verbal directions. They really do respond to the actual presentation of the reward. So if you're going to reinforce a behavior or reward it, make sure you give them the reinforcer or the reward after the behavior you want to see more frequently. Now, we call this Thorndike's law of effect. Really, this guy named E.L. Thorndike pioneered this idea of operant conditioning long before B.F. Skinner ever got his hands on it. And according to Thorndike, behavior is influenced by the consequences that follow it. So if you have satisfying consequences right after a behavior, that increases the chance that the behavior is going to happen again. So you do something and you have pleasing results, you're probably going to do that thing again in the future. Now, if you have annoying consequences for a behavior, that's going to decrease the chance you're going to do that behavior again. So you do something, and then the result of that behavior annoys or harms you in some way, you're less likely to engage in that behavior again. So again, for example, the kid cleans their room and they are rewarded with their allowance given to them a little bit earlier. So that's a satisfying result, and it will increase the chance that they're going to clean their room again. But if you clean their room and then start to yell at them about how they didn't clean it sooner, that's an annoying consequence. And do you know what's going to happen? It's going to reduce the chance of your kid cleaning their room again. Now, in operant conditioning, we can document the changes that occur in a behavior over time using what we call a learning curve. So really, when you have a learning curve, this is just kind of a graph that shows you how learning has taken place over time. And usually what we end up seeing is when you begin a behavior, it takes a really, really long time for you to pick it up. So we're going to have a really, really high value on the curve and slowly drops off to a lower value, reflecting the fact that the behavior becomes more frequent the more that you reward it. Now, many experiments that have documented operant conditioning have done so using a tool called a Skinner box. And the Skinner box is a device that we just place organisms inside when they experience the effects of operant and classical conditioning. And really, this was built by B.F. Skinner, who is also a kind of an amateur inventor in addition to being one of the world's most renowned psychologists. And I'm going to show you a quick picture of a learning curve, and then I'm going to show you a quick picture of a Skinner box. Okay, here's that image of the learning curve that I was talking about. Now, on the left, kind of on the y-axis, we have latency in seconds. Now, latency just means how long it takes to do something. And you can see that the latency in seconds starts out pretty high, which means it takes a long time for the organism to engage in an operantly conditioned behavior at first. But as you start to reward them, look what happens as we move along the x-axis over trial, which means how many opportunities we give the organism to perform the behavior. You see how that latency starts to drop over time? You see, this is what we mean by a learning curve. We're dropping off. In other words, we're acquiring the behavior. It's becoming much more frequent. And by trial 60, the organism has learned pretty quickly that if they perform this specific behavior, they're going to get rewarded for it, so they don't spend a lot of time hesitating to perform the behavior itself. Now let me show you. Here is a basic Skinner box setup, and this is again just kind of a diagram of one. We see that the rat is inside the box. We have a grid on the floor that is electrified. And remember when I mentioned in video 2 how we've run experiments using lights and speakers and electric shocks on rats? Well, you can see that the Skinner box has those devices built into it in case you wanted to do any experimentation on operant conditioning. Now, sorry, I apologize. I meant experimentation for classical conditioning. It also lets you run experiments on operant conditioning as well, and that's what happens when the rat is pressing that little silver bar right there. You see how there's this automated pellet dispenser connected by a dispenser tube to the food cup inside the cage? What's happening there is the rat very slowly learns that if it presses the bar, it then is rewarded with a delicious food pellet. This is essentially a setup used to operantly condition rats to give us the behavior of pressing that silver lever many, many, many times. Now, they don't know what's going on the first time they get inside the Skinner box. They sort of sniff around the corners and hide and sort of wait to see what's going to happen. And then if you're not getting shocked or shown lights or sounds, they might accidentally brush up against the silver bar. And when they do this, a pellet's going to be released. Now, the rat likes the pellet, it eats it, and then it tries to figure out what it did to get the pellet. So it will continue to explore the cage, and eventually it will bump back in to that silver bar. And then what happens is the pellet comes out again. And the rat slowly begins to learn, hey, if I press this silver bar, I get food pellets as a result. And very quickly, it begins to press that bar multiple times until it is basically leaning on that bar almost all the time to get as many food pellets as it possibly can. That's also a good way to illustrate that same process that I just showed you with the learning curve in the last slide. That's essentially the data that documents precisely what I just described, how a rat slowly learns that if it presses this bar, it's going to get a food pellet, and then the time in between bar presses drops very quickly. Now, when we use operant conditioning, we have what we call a three-part contingency. Now remember with classical conditioning we had the UCS, the UCR, the CS, and the CR. Well, the operant conditioning system has its own set of subconditions as well, and they're a little bit easier to grasp than the classical conditioning process. Now, the first thing you need is what we call the antecedent of the behavior. This is just the stimulus that's present before the behavior occurs. Now, with that rat that I just showed you, the antecedent in this case would, in that case at least, would be the presence of that silver bar. With the kid who needs to clean their room, the antecedent would be either your prompt to clean the room or the fact that their room is dirty. Next, we need to see the behavior occur. So this is when the organism responds, and this would be the rat pressing that bar or the kid cleaning their room. Now, once the behavior has occurred, consequences need to be administered to either reinforce the behavior with positive and pleasant consequences to get it to happen again, or with annoying consequences to prevent it from happening again. So the kid has cleaned their room. You administer a consequence then by, again, let's just go with a positive example. You give them their allowance, and this reinforces the behavior. In the case of the rat presses against the bar. They're then rewarded with a consequence of the food pellet coming out of the food dispenser. Now, the consequences will either increase the likelihood of the behavior if they are pleasant consequences, what we would call reinforcement of some form, or they will reduce the chances of the behavior occurring again if they are annoying consequences. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can set these consequences up. We have both what we call positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment. But I'll get into those in just a bit. Now, reinforcement needs to be some procedure that you use to increase the rate of a desired behavior. And let me put this in English. The procedure just means you have some kind of reward or punishment process that you administer, whether you either administer pleasing consequences or annoying consequences to alter the rate. And by rate, we just means, that was terrible grammar, I apologize. What we mean by rate simply is the frequency that the behavior occurs, or how often a behavior occurs. Now, the reinforcer really is just the event that follows the behavior that will increase the probability of that behavior. A reinforcer, when we use the term reinforcer, we mean we're trying to strengthen the chance that behavior is going to occur again. Now, a punishment is whatever procedure you use to decrease the rate of the undesired behavior. So you've got a behavior you don't want to happen again. It's something that's irritating to you or annoying, or a behavior that is potentially harmful. So maybe you have your kid talk back to you when you ask them to clean their room. Or maybe you have a dog who keeps jumping up on the furniture in the house and you don't want them to do this. Now, you can punish this behavior, and that will result in the behavior reducing in its frequency. And really, a punishment or a punisher is just any event that follows the behavior that's going to decrease the probability of that behavior occurring again. So it decreases the chances of your kid being rude to you again, or it decreases the chances of the dog jumping up onto the... Now, there's a way that you can turn almost anything into something that is rewarding. And everybody has what we call a normal state of equilibrium. And this is just a state in which we equally divide our time among the various activities we like to perform. To kind of picture the ideal way that you would like to spend your day, or the ideal way you'd like to spend your time, and you get a kind of idea about how this principle is supposed to work. It assumes that we have a certain amount of time we want to spend sleeping, or eating, or watching TV, or exercising, or doing work, or not doing work, and sort of wandering around on the internet with no aim in mind at all whatsoever. And because there's a certain amount of time we desire to spend performing each of these specific activities, when we are denied access to one of those activities, it suddenly becomes something we really, really, really wish we could do. Think about it like this. What happens if your internet connection suddenly vanishes for a couple days? After a while, you really start to miss the presence of the internet, and you really want to get on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever social media site you're used to, or you want to search the web or watch Netflix, but you can't do those activities anymore, so you really start to kind of crave them and miss them. And the opportunity just to spend a little time on the internet then after that becomes incredibly pleasurable to you. It's like getting, or you can think of it like this, what happens if you are denied the opportunity to eat for a really, really long time? The first bite of whatever piece of food you happen to find after not being able to eat for a really long time is extremely pleasing and extremely rewarding. And this is essentially what the disequilibrium principle takes advantage of. Now, if you've had a limited opportunity to engage in one of your behaviors, you are in disequilibrium. And any opportunity you get to increase that behavior will allow you to go back to equilibrium, and as a result, it will be reinforcing. So what that means is you can take any human activity, and if you deny access to it for a certain amount of time, depending on what the activity is, that the opportunity to then engage in that activity again becomes reinforcing. So let's say you have this kid who mouths off to you, and you decide that what you're going to do is punish them by taking away their TV privileges. Now, the kid's going to complain, and they're going to whine, they're going to demand that they actually get to sit and watch TV, but if you continue to deny them access to it, pretty soon they're really going to be jonesing to watch an episode of their favorite show. Here's what you then have the opportunity to do. You have just transformed television time into an extremely powerful reward, and you tell them, if you clean your room, you will earn 30 minutes of television time. And then when they clean their room, allow them to watch TV 30 minutes and then cut it off immediately. And then tell them, hey, you have to do more chores in order to earn more TV time. What this will do is, because you're denying access to television, you are giving it such this amazing reward-like status in the mind of your child that they will do whatever they can to get access back to it. And it suddenly transforms into its own rewarding behavior. Same thing with desserts and sweet foods. If you deny access to them on a regular basis, they become a treat or a rewarding, exciting thing that they only get to experience if they have been on their best behavior. Again, this really harnesses the power of knocking them out of an equilibrium state they would like to be in and then slowly giving them the opportunity to come back to it. Incidentally, it's a good way to teach self-control. Now, let's talk about the different kinds of reinforcements that we have. First of all, we have positive reinforcement. Now, when I say positive reinforcement, and I'm going to introduce you to the other three kinds, which include negative reinforcement, and then positive punishment, and negative punishment, the terms positive and negative here do not mean good or bad. What they mean instead is give and take. So when I say positive reinforcement, I mean I am giving reinforcement. And when I say negative reinforcement, it means I'm taking something away. Now let's start with positive reinforcement. With positive reinforcement, you have a response or behavior that you like a child cleaning their room, and you want to strengthen this response by the subsequent presentation of something rewarding or good, which we would then call a positive reinforcer. Now again, this could be allowance money in this case, so the kid cleans their room and then you use allowance money as a positive reinforcement. It's positively reinforcing because you give them their allowance money. You are adding something to them after the behavior has been completed, and it reinforces the behavior and makes them want to do it again. Or in the example that I just used about television time, this would be then giving the kid the opportunity to watch their favorite television show after showing good behavior. So positive reinforcement really is giving someone a treat or something pleasing after they have exhibited a behavior you want to see again. We can break this down very simply. You're adding something, in this case, which is the allowance, and it will increase the desired behavior, which is cleaning the room. When you do this, there are two kinds of reinforcers. First, we have a primary reinforcer. And this is a stimulus that any organism is going to naturally find reinforcing. What we mean by this is it's going to satisfy a biological need. And there aren't a whole lot of primary reinforcers. Food is an excellent example of a primary reinforcer because we naturally need this, and eating food is naturally pleasing. Sex is another excellent example of a primary reinforcer because, again, we have a powerful sex drive and the act itself is extremely pleasing. So there you go. Those are the two least easiest to think of variations on a primary reinforcer. Now this leads into what we call a secondary reinforcer. A secondary reinforcer is any stimulus that acquires some kind of reinforcing property through its association with primary reinforcers. So in other words, a secondary reinforcer is going to grant you access to a primary reinforcer, or a secondary reinforcer is paired with a primary reinforcer where it kind of is classically conditioned to take on qualities of the primary reinforcer. Two quickest ones I can think of would be money and education. Both are supposed to grant access to a variety of primary reinforcers that satisfy basic biological needs. In particular, access to the ability to provide for yourself or feed yourself, and also provide shelter for yourself and people that you care about. Really important functions of money and education. Okay, let's move on to negative reinforcement. And this is one of the trickiest topics I'm going to teach all quarter. Now, remember, when we say positive and negative, when we're talking about reinforcements or punishments, they do not mean good or bad. Positive means giving. Negative means taking away. Now, with negative reinforcement, here's what's going to happen. We want to get rid of something aversive. And by aversive, we mean something irritating, obnoxious, grating, painful, or annoying. Now, let's just say you have a baby who is crying, and they are crying with all of the force and might of their tiny little lungs, just shrieking as loud as they possibly can. What you do then is you respond to the presence of that annoying stimulus. And the behavior that you initiate is probably going to be picking the baby up. Now, when you pick up the baby, it stops crying. What's happened here is the baby then has increased the chances you're going to pick up the baby again. So when you put the baby down and it starts crying, you pick it up right away and it stops. Then you set the baby down and it starts shrieking again, and you come over and you pick the baby up and it stops crying. Now that lets you know right away the baby really wants to be picked up and really likes being held by you. But what the baby is doing is manipulating your behavior. You see, what's happening is the baby is reinforcing the behavior of picking the baby up by taking away a negative or annoying stimulus, or aversive stimulus. So in other words, when you pick the baby up and the irritating crying goes away, you have been negatively reinforced by the baby. You see, negative reinforcement just means you get a behavior to become more frequent by taking away something that is irritating. And the fact that the irritating thing has been removed has reinforced your behavior, because the second that baby is quiet, you feel so relieved and happy that it is no longer shrieking and howling in your ears. That's how negative reinforcement works. You take away an annoying or aversive stimulus, and the absence of the irritation is pleasing and reinforces the behavior that got rid of that stimulus. Aspirin kind of works in this way too. You have a really strong, painful headache. You take an aspirin. The headache goes away and you feel better. And the fact that the removal of the headache is paired with the aspirin means you have been negatively reinforced to take an aspirin the next time you have a headache. Bottom line is this. You take away the negative reinforcer and you strengthen the desired behavior. In other words, you're more likely to keep holding that baby to keep it from crying. In other words, the next time you have a headache, you're going to take an aspirin because it keeps the headache away. The painful or annoying thing is the negative reinforcer. You want to get rid of it, and that will, again, be pleasing and make you want to then engage in whatever you did to get rid of that negative or annoying. Next, let's move on to the different kinds of punishment. Now we have positive punishment and negative punishment. We're going to begin with positive punishment. Positive punishment is sometimes called aversive punishment. Now remember, positive in operant conditioning terms means we're adding something or we're giving something. Now what this means here is we have some response we don't like. And we are weakening the chances of that response from happening again by presenting some kind of painful or aversive stimulus. So, what this means is you have a child who misbehaves. Let's say the child refuses to clean their room, like the example that I gave earlier. And what you then do is you decide to punish that child. Now, if you are using positive punishment, you are introducing something painful or unpleasant. Maybe as positive punishment, you force them to eat a plate of green vegetables, which would kind of be cruel and unusual. But the most common type of positive punishment when it comes to kids is spanking. The kid disobeys your commands or disobeys your orders, and you spank them as a result. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate about whether or not spanking is beneficial or harmful. I don't really want to delve into that. B.F. Skinner himself, the guy who really championed this, really deeply believed that positive punishment or aversive punishment was not as effective in modifying a person's behavior in the long term. He really believed that it was better to use different forms of punishment, particularly negative punishment, or just to focus exclusively on positive reinforcement when modifying people's behavior. And that belief has largely been supported by research. Now, we sometimes also call this applied punishment. Now, let me give you another example. Let's say you have that dog who's jumping up on the couch. You don't have to use pain at all when you are administering positive punishment. It doesn't have to be painful. Now, with the dog that jumps up on the couch, what you can do is just get a spray bottle and fill it with water. Now, remember, we just need an annoying or unpleasant stimulus, not necessarily painful. So every time the dog jumps up on the couch, you spray them in the face with a little bit of water. And it's just a mist, just enough to kind of make their face feel wet and make them feel unpleasant. And you spray them in the face with that water, and then they jump off the couch. Because they think when they get up on the couch, they're going to get sprayed and make them kind of feel wet and sticky and nasty, and they don't like that. So every time the dog does this, they jump off the couch, you use positive or applied punishment here, and you spray them in the face with water, and they jump down, and eventually they learn to stay away from the couch. Again, so positive punishment does not have to be painful. It can just be something that's annoying or irritating. Maybe you decide, for instance, if your kid refuses to clean their room, you can try to apply negative reinforcement or positive punishment, maybe by singing in a really, really loud, obnoxious song that drives your kids crazy. Or you can apply positive punishment by forcing them to sit down and watch, I don't know, the most boring, longest movie you can think of, maybe like the full 6-hour version of the Arts and Entertainment original series Pride and Prejudice, or making them sit down and watch really, really long, technical World War II documentaries. There's a lot of different things that you can do to be creative with applied punishment. It does not have to resort to any kind of actual physical harm. The goal here ultimately is to decrease the undesired response. Now, I have heard of some interesting cases where parents have experimented with different forms of aversive or applied punishment instead of defaulting to spanking. One example I know of, for instance, is if you have two kids who are fighting. What you do then is if you tell them to go run laps around the house, or to start to run stairs if you have stairs in the home. This works in two ways. One, because it's an aversive or unpleasant consequence to their behavior, and two, it also tires them out so they have less energy to get into trouble. So, there you go. Next, we have negative punishment, or what we sometimes call a response cost. This is also occasionally called omission training. What we're doing with negative punishment, and remember, negative means taking something away, is we are removing something from the participant or the child or the animal or whatever. We're taking something away from them because of their bad behavior. They engage in a response that we find unpleasant or bad or harmful, so what we do is we take away something. And there are a couple ways that you can do this. Taking away privileges is one of the quickest examples of this. Grounding a child is an example of negative punishment. The picture that I have here is of a policeman checking someone's speed. So when you get pulled over and for speeding and you're given a ticket, the ticket is taking away something that is desirable because it's taking away your money and your time. So again, you remove or deny access to time or privileges or activities or things that lead to other positive reinforcements or any primary reinforcers and secondary reinforcers what you're essentially doing is engaging in negative punishment. So negative, again, here just means you take something away from them. Now, once you remove something, the idea here is they begin to look at that specific behavior or that response that you found unpleasant as costly, because it's going to result in them losing something to engage in that behavior. And then, as a result, it should result in a reduction of the frequency of that response. Let me give you a couple quick examples. I just want to review the stuff I've talked about so far. I know I've just thrown a ton of information at you in the last half hour, and I just want to give you guys the opportunity to try this out. Now, here are just two examples. Let's start with example 1. Now, you give your dog a treat when he sits. In other words, you tell your dog, sit, and the dog sits, and then you give them a treat. Write down what kind of reinforcement or punishment is happening here. Is this positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? Is this positive punishment or negative punishment? Next, below that, we have this situation. We have an unhappy coach who makes a player run laps for showing up late to practice. Now, what's going on here? Is this positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? Is this positive punishment or negative punishment? Pause the video, write down your responses to these two questions, and then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll continue. Okay, let's take a quick look at the answers. If you're giving your dog a treat when he sits because you told him to sit, that's positive reinforcement because you're giving them something pleasing. And if you're an unhappy coach who makes a tardy student run laps, what you're doing is you are then engaging in adversive or positive punishment. Now, the idea here is you're adding something that they're not going to enjoy very much because you're making them run laps, and that's an unpleasant thing that you've added to their day. Let's try these two examples. In exchange for $3, you remove a leech from your friend's back. Now think about that one very, very carefully. Now this could be positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. It could be positive punishment or negative punishment. Figure out which one you think it is and write that down. Then at the bottom here, after being caught for underage drinking, a student is suspended from school. Is this positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement? Positive punishment or negative punishment? Again, pause the video, write down your answers. When you're ready, unpause, and let's find out what it was. Okay, let's take a look at the answers to these two. First of all, removing the leech from a friend's back in exchange for $3. That's actually negative reinforcement. So in other words, your friend gives you $3, and as a result, you remove the leech from their back. Now what that means is the behavior of them giving you $3 is negatively reinforced by getting that leech off of there. In other words, you take away the unpleasant thing, and they are happy as a result. Now, for the underage drinking example, that's actually response cost or negative punishment. You're taking away the student's rights because of their bad behavior. Administering reinforcement and punishment is more than just deciding what kind of reinforcement or punishment you want to use. The way that you administer it and the timing of the administration is also very critical. And we call this a schedule of reinforcement. Now, with the schedule of reinforcement, you can choose to reinforce every single time the behavior occurs. And that's called continuous reinforcement. So let's say you're training your dog to sit. That means every single time your dog obeys you and sits, then you would give them a dog treat as a result. Continuous reinforcement is really useful for getting the behavior to occur at a really high rate of frequency. In other words, every time you tell them to sit, as long as you give them a treat, they are going to sit. The problem happens, though, when you stop giving them a treat. If you've only been working them on a continuous reinforcement schedule, you'll notice that the behavior goes away pretty fast once the treats disappear. Now let me give you another example of this. Soda machines, or pop machines, or whatever you prefer to call soft drinks. Every time you put, let's just say, $1.25, I'm sure that amount is probably not actually accurate of how much they actually cost. I'm sure it's up like to $2 now or something like that. But okay, so you put money into the soft drink machine, and you press a button. You expect that it's going to give you a refreshing, carbonated, sugary beverage as a result. The instant that you hit that button after putting your money into that machine and it fails to work correctly, you stop trusting that machine. Because what essentially has happened is every pop or soda machine or snack machine you've ever met that consistently did its job kept you on a continuous reinforcement schedule. You see, every time you put money in, they reward you by giving you something delicious to eat or drink. And the second that they violate that trust, the second that you put money in and press a button and nothing comes out, that's the instant you stop trusting that machine. That's how powerful these continuous reinforcement schedules are. Now, continuous reinforcement, again, like I said, the second the reward stops coming, the behavior is very soon going to vanish. That's why partial reinforcement schedules can be applied, and this is where we only reinforce some responses. Now, a partial reinforcement schedule does not work for every behavior. It sure is not going to work for a vending machine, which should give you something every time you put money into it. But a slot machine at a casino, however, doesn't need to work that way. As a matter of fact, slot machines are designed off of partial reinforcement schedules, and they operantly condition gamblers to continue to pump money into those machines. Now, there are 4 types of these reinforcement schedules. In other words, there are 4 types of partial reinforcement. I'm going to start with a fixed ratio schedule. This is the very, very first type of partial reinforcement schedule. What we do with a fixed ratio schedule is we reinforce a behavior after a fixed number of responses. Just as an example, let's say I'm trying to teach my dog to jump up and down, because why not? I want to teach my dog to just leap in the air, and I use a fixed ratio schedule. That means every 5 times my dog jumps, my dog will then receive a treat. And now, I'm not reinforcing the behavior every single time, which means that I'm making the I'm making the reinforcement unpredictable. Now, if you make the reinforcement unpredictable, you're actually going to get a higher rate of response from the creature you're trying to condition. So my dog doesn't know that the treat shows up every 5 times, so they're going to jump on a pretty consistent basis, and then they will receive a treat as a reward. Now, this is going to give you a very high rate of responding as a result of this, and you can actually increase the ratio slowly over time for a great deal of responses connected with very few actual rewards. What I mean by that is, so I start out my dog jumping 5 times, and every 5th jump, my dog gets a treat. So I can, after some time, kind of move that up to maybe every 7 jumps. And then after another long period of time, I slowly move that up to every 9 jumps, and then from that I move it up to every 10 jumps, and then every 11 after that, and I keep going until, I'd say, every 20 jumps gets my dog a treat. Now, if you use pretty broad pretty large numbers of behaviors in between rewards, you can get a bit of a disadvantage to this kind of schedule. The problem with this is that the behavior may pause briefly after you've administered some kind of reinforcement. So let's say you're using this on your kid. You want your kid to clean their room 5 times before you give them their allowance. The second the kid gets their hands on the allowance and you tell them to clean their room, they're probably not going to do it right away. The reason that they're probably not going to do it right away is because you're using kind of a predictable pattern. The kid knows they're not going to get paid right away for cleaning. Some animals are able to figure this stuff out pretty quickly as well. If you have a creature of sufficient intelligence, this becomes quite a problem. So what you end up with is what we call kind of a reduction in responding immediately after the reinforcer has been administered. Now, there are ways to counteract that, of course, and I'm going to show you one of them here in just a second. Now, of course, not before this. Yeah, this is just what I just said. They know the next behavior is not going to be reinforced. Get around this by varying the ratio. We call this a variable ratio schedule. This is what a slot machine uses. Now, reinforcement is given after a variable number of responses, and you just randomly change up how many behaviors you need to see before a reinforcement is given in between every single reinforcement. So let's say I've got my dog. My dog jumps 10 times. Then I give them a treat, and I've reinforced them. But then, because I've reinforced them, I randomly pick another number. So I go, okay, let's say this time I need to see 3 jumps. Then my dog has to jump 3 times, and then I give them a treat. Then that means they have to jump. Then I'm going to randomly pick another number after that reinforcer. Let's go with 5, so that the dog has to jump 5 times. Then they get a treat. Now, after that reinforcement has happened, let's say I randomly pick another number, and the first one off the top of my head is 17. So my dog has to jump 17 times before they get the treat. You see, what we're doing here is every time we reinforce, we pick a new number of behaviors we want to see before the organism receives reinforcement for that behavior. So let's take the example of that kid. Let's say the kid has to clean their room 5 times and they get their allowance. And then you randomly pick a number in your head of times they have to clean the room before they get the allowance again. So let's say it's 3. So they have to clean the room 3 times, and on the 3rd time, bam, there's their allowance. And what they're going to do then is start cleaning the room again right away the next time you tell them, because you've picked another random number in your head of number of times that the room needs to get cleaned. They don't know what the number is. Maybe they just clean the room once, and bam, you give them their allowance again. Then you pick another random number. And let's say the kid starts cleaning their room, and after 10 times of cleaning their room, bam, you give them their allowance again. You see, what you've done is you have made the allowance so unpredictable that the kid has no idea when the next instance of cleaning their room will give them their allowance. The same thing with the dog. The dog does not know when the reinforcer is going to show up. And because it's so unpredictable, they engage in the behavior as frequently as they possibly can in the hopes of receiving a reward for doing that behavior. This is precisely what slot machines do. You sit down in a slot machine, and it constantly varies the probability of you getting a reward from pulling the lever. Between each lever pull, probabilities are reset every single time. And you honestly have no idea what the chances are of you getting a specific pull you do, and you know that they're slim, but it's so unpredictable, it keeps you glued there pulling that lever, because you start to get this idea in your head that the next pull could be your big payoff. Now, incidentally, that's a cognitive illusion called the gambler's fallacy. It's not really true. The slots reset the probabilities every single time you pull one of them. It's called sampling with replacement. So that means every single time you pull, you always have the chances of a jackpot are always super, super, super rare. They never increase over time. They always stay fixed, and they're always extremely slim. But from your standpoint, you're getting these tiny little reinforcements at random when you're getting paid out like a couple bucks back, or you're losing the money that you play on the pull. So these rewards are coming at really random times, and it's so random from your point of view, there's no reason to stop pulling, and it's still reinforcing to stay there because you never know what you might get on the next pull. Video games have harnessed this technique of randomizing rewards for playing the game. They call these loot drops in games like Diablo and Borderlands. The item drops that you get from killing enemies in the game are randomized in such a way that there's a really slim probability of getting something super rare, but because of how rare it is, it produces a very high rate of responding, and because it's so unpredictable what you're going to get, people play those games for long periods of time because of the chances of receiving really random and rare loot. I believe the upcoming game by Bungie Studios called Destiny, I think, is going to use a randomized loot system as well, which means the game will probably be very addictive with its gameplay. Now, because there's a very high rate of responding here, and because the reinforcement rate is so unpredictable, there's a very low rate of pause in between instances of these behaviors when you're using a variable ratio schedule. It's really an extremely effective way to operantly condition a behavior that you desire. Incidentally, because this kind of behavior and this kind of reinforcement is so randomized, if you just decided out of nowhere to stop giving your kid their allowance, and you just don't kind of tell them, and they still will kind of continue to clean their room because they maybe just think that you picked a really big number of cleans that they have to perform before getting reinforced of the behavior. Because again, they never know if the next behavior is going to be the one that's going to result in them getting their allowance. So this means that these behaviors are extremely resistant to extinction. And if you use a variable ratio schedule to condition an operantly conditioned behavior, it's going to stick around for a very, very long time. Next, we have a fixed interval schedule. Now, we've talked about fixed ratio schedules before. We're switching over to something a little bit different now. Instead of manipulating the number of times that a behavior has to occur, we're going to manipulate the amount of time that takes place in between reinforcements. Here's what this looks like. So the first correct response after a fixed time period is reinforced. So what this means is, let me take my jumping dog here just as an example. So let's say the dog is jumping and jumping and jumping and jumping, and I give them a treat. So after they've received the treat, what I do is I set a timer for 2 minutes, and I let it go. And I let them keep jumping, and I let them keep jumping, and I let them keep jumping. But I do not reinforce the jumping behavior until the timer goes off. Now, once 2 minutes have passed, the timer goes off. The very first time the dog jumps after the timer is done, they will get rewarded with a treat. Then I reset the timer for another 2 minutes and let it go again. And when the timer goes off after another 2 minutes, the first instance of jumping is going to get reinforced, and then I reset the timer after that. With the kid cleaning their room, maybe what you do is you just decide that you're going to only administer the allowance once a week. So the first instance of them cleaning their room after 1 week has passed will get reinforced with an allowance. Then you again wait another week, and the very first instance of them cleaning their room again will result in them getting their allowance. And what we're doing here is we're still introducing some kind of randomization, because the kid doesn't necessarily know that you've decided to use this kind of schedule when you reinforce their behavior. So when they perform this task of cleaning their room, they can kind of choose when they do that, or you can choose when to prompt them to do that. And it can be any amount of time before or after that week. And you can only, of course, reinforce after that actual week has passed. This is a pretty interesting way to do reinforcement. It takes out the need to count up the number of behaviors between trials. You just know, okay, the timer's up, we're going to use reinforcement now. The problem with this is it creates what we call a scalloping effect, and this is a very distinct dip in responding after the reinforcement has been given. So responses are going to be super slow at first, but as you get closer and closer and closer to the time when the reinforcement is going to occur, the response rate picks up a little bit, and then the reinforcer hits, and you get a lot of the response, and then you get some high rate of responding for a bit after the reinforcer, but then the behavior just dips off after a while. So with that 2 minute timer that I set for my dog, so my dog jumps, gets a treat, the timer gets reset, I ask my dog to jump again, and they're probably not going to jump for a while, again, because they can tell they aren't going to get rewarded for a fixed amount of time. Again, dogs are pretty good at picking up patterns. Kids are also excellent at picking up patterns like this. If they figured out that you wait a week between each time you give them an allowance, they're not going to clean their room until they absolutely have to. Incidentally, this is how paychecks work. Paychecks are administered, for the most part, after 2 or 3 week periods or on specific dates during the month. And if you have somebody on a paycheck payment system, what you typically see, especially if they're salaried instead of hourly, they really just do a lot of work close to the time they're going to get paid, and then they kind of relax and blow things off for the rest of the time that they're at work. Or at least maybe you know somebody who's done something like this. You work really hard when you get paid, when you know that you've been reinforced for the hard work you put in, but, the day after you get your paycheck, maybe you just sort of put your feet up and relax a little bit, and you don't work quite as hard. Then you work a little bit harder the closer you get to the next pay period. Again, that's called a scalloping of response. It just means a dip after you've received reinforcement. This leads us to the variable interval schedule. Now, again, with a fixed ratio, you see a decrease after responding. And with a fixed interval, again, there's still a decrease after the reinforcement has taken place. Now, the variable interval does something similar to the variable ratio, except instead of randomizing the number of behaviors, we're going to randomize the amount of time between reinforcers. So the reinforcement is given for the first correct response after a variable time interval. So the dog, let's go back to that example. They're going to jump for 2 minutes, then I'm going to give them a reward. Then I'm going to punch in a random time into my timer. Let's just say 1 minute. They jump for 1 minute. Oh, guess what? Then they get a reward. Then I reset the timer for another random time. And they jump for 3.5 minutes, and then they get a reward. This makes the reinforcement extremely unpredictable, because not only are we not relying on number of behaviors occurring, we are just picking an arbitrary amount of time at random after each and every single reinforcement. And it makes it very, very difficult for anyone to figure out what kind of reinforcement schedule you are using if you pick this one. Because sometimes it sort of seems like you're using a variable ratio one, sometimes it'll seem like you're using a fixed ratio, sometimes it may even look like you're using a fixed interval, but then they really just kind of try to engage the behavior again and realize that there's no way to predict at all whatsoever when their behaviors are going to be reinforced, because you're just randomly picking amounts of time. Now, you could do this if you were setting up payment options for employees, but it would be extremely unethical if you were randomizing times on the order of like years and months. In other words, they don't get paid for a year. That's not going to work too well with, employment laws. But this would be a really useful technique for dealing with kids who are being resistant to cleaning rooms. If you want to randomize the amount of time between the time when they actually get their allowance after cleaning the room, but stick to something like time units no larger than a week. So like every day or so you can randomize, maybe like 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, 3 days, 4 days, or a couple hours if you really want to mess with their heads. Now, this variable interval schedule is extremely unpredictable. It's going to give you a pretty high chance that the response rate is going to stay very, very high. It's much, much steadier than the fixed interval. Not quite as stable and intense as the response rate you're going to get to a variable ratio, but still pretty good. Now, B.F. Skinner did some experimentation with pigeons in his lab, and what he did is he set the food pellet dispenser system in some Skinner boxes for random timers. I just thought to set the time at random for this, and he left for the weekend to go home. And the way that the random timer works is it would dispense a food pellet after a pigeon engages in some kind of behavior, and then it would randomize the amount of time between that reward and the next coming food pellet. And it kept doing this throughout the entire weekend. He comes back, and he finds that his pigeons have developed a variety of really weird behaviors. One pigeon runs in circles around the cage and then pokes its head against the wall 3 or 4 times, and then it walks up to the food dispenser and waits for a reward. And if that doesn't happen, then it repeats that weird behavior. Another pigeon bends over and touches its head to the ground 4 times, and then looks at the food pellet dispenser, and then goes back and keeps doing this until the next reward occurs. Other pigeons would do weird things like hop on one foot, or try to roll over in somersaults, or bonk their heads against the side of the cage. And what Skinner had discovered is he had made the rewarding of these pigeons so random. The pigeons had just happened to have been doing something strange when food pellets appeared. And the pigeons started to get this idea in their heads that their arbitrary and bizarre behaviors were the causes of these food pellets being administered, when in reality it was just on a randomized timer. Essentially what Skinner did is he created superstitious behavior in his pigeons. Variable interval schedules are one of the things that kind of reward and reinforce superstitious behaviors, because we never know really the amount of time between each reinforcement of a superstitious behavior, because largely it's due to random chance. And this is why some athletes might have what they consider lucky pieces of clothing, because they believe that if they wear that piece of clothing, then they're going to win at the specific game that they're playing. But really, it's kind of the amount of time in between wins is pretty distant and randomized. And because it's not really under the conscious control of the athlete, they begin to associate random, unrelated things with those events of success and reward. Here's a quick graph that represents these 4 schedules. You can see that what we have over here is time in minutes it takes to for these schedules to be effective. And over here on the y-axis, the y-axis is what I meant to say. We have the cumulative number of responses, so how frequently the schedule is giving you a response. And you can see that the fixed ratio is that red line there, and it gives you a pretty steady rate of responding fairly fast. And you can see the hash marks along the red line is when you actually reinforce. Now at first, it's pretty steady state, but then the responses begin to dip, and that line gets more jagged as it goes higher up on the cumulative number of responses. Now with the variable ratio, you can see that it's a straighter line than the fixed ratio line. That's the blue line next to the red one. And that's because the reward is so randomized, the organism has no clue when the next behavior is going to be rewarded. Now remember how I said that the fixed interval schedule, that's kind of the green line that's coming next here, the third one if we're going from left to right. The fixed interval, you just pick the same amount of time in between each response or each reinforcement. Now you see how it has this really consistent bumpy shape to it? That's the scalloping effect that I was talking about. That just means the response rate drops off super fast after the reinforcement because the organism can figure out pretty quickly that it isn't going to get rewarded right away. And the variable interval ratio is the last one. It's sort of the yellowish, goldish, orangish, maybe line. Not really too sure on my monitor here. But you can see we randomize the amount of time between rewards, and it has a less of a scalloping effect present. It's a pretty smooth, consistent line, and it really just represents a steady rate of responding. But you can see that the interval schedules take a longer time to acquire and get a high rate of response. With the ratio schedules give you a high rate of response pretty quickly. The overall bottom line for this is if you want a very fast rate of learning, but you're willing to suffer with the fast rate of extinction for a behavior, a continuous schedule is probably the tool for you. But if you want the behavior to last a longer amount of time, a partial reinforcement schedule like one of the 4 that I just showed you, they do have slower learning, but they are much more resistant to extinction in the long run. Now, before we conclude our lecture on operant conditioning for this video, I have something that I want to let you guys know about. It's called the process of shaping and the process of chaining. Shaping and chaining are extremely important tools to anyone who uses operant conditioning to alter anything's behavior. Shaping just means that you reinforce successive approximations toward a specific behavior that you want. Now, Skinner practiced this with his pigeons. He wanted to teach a pigeon to turn a somersault. So what he would do is he would look for a pigeon that was slowly bending over to peck at something, and Skinner would then reinforce the pigeon if the pigeon bent over really low. Then what Skinner would do is he would only reinforce the pigeon if the pigeon put its head on the ground. He would reinforce that behavior until the pigeon was consistently putting its head on the ground. Then Skinner would only reinforce the pigeon if it put that head on the ground in between its legs. And it would keep reinforcing that head between the legs behavior until it was a really consistent thing. Then Skinner would only reinforce the pigeon if it tried to walk forward with its head on the ground. Once that behavior was pretty consistent, Skinner would only reinforce the pigeon if it would fall over forwards, by accident at that point, because it kept putting its head in between its legs and trying to walk forward. Then what eventually Skinner would end up with is a series of pigeons who have been successively rewarded to approximate the behavior of turning a somersault. And by the time he's done, then he has a set of pigeons that are turning somersaults. This is incidentally the way that you teach a dog to sit. You have to shape this behavior by getting them to sort of follow your hand, first of all, as it goes sort of up over their head, and that forces the dog to look up, and it lowers their rear. This gets the dog to sit, and you reward the dog for sitting. And then you slowly get the dog to learn to lower its head to the ground and reward successive approximations of that, and that teaches the dog to lie down. Once you've done this, you can then chain behaviors together. And this is basically reinforcing a response with the opportunity to perform the next response in a series. So Skinner taught his pigeons to turn somersaults, and once they turned a somersault, then he would have them turn a somersault, and he would reinforce them right in front of a little hoop. And once the pigeon turned a somersault, it got that reward, then it would sometimes jump to the hoop. And if it jumps through the hoop, then it gets rewarded for doing that. So in other words, the pigeon would then turn a somersault, and then jump through a hoop, and then get reinforced after that. Then, once that was done, the pigeon would turn the somersault, jump through the hoop, and there was a little ball that the pigeon could hop on top of and balance on. And then Skinner would reinforce the pigeon for then jumping on top of that and trying to balance on it. And using a process like that, Skinner was able to then condition his pigeons into a pigeon circus, where they would turn a somersault, jump through a hoop, balance on a ball, then hop up on a little pigeon high wire and walk across it very, very quickly. Chaining is used to link desired behaviors together. Sitting and lying down and then rolling over is a chained series of behaviors that involve shaping to get to. Playing fetch is a set of chained behaviors, for example. And really cleaning a room, or having a kid clean a room, is a set of chained behaviors. Animal trainers use operant conditioning all the time. Let me show you a squirrel that has been chained to stand and balance on water skis using operant conditioning behind a little remote control boat. The United States Navy actually trains dolphins to detect explosive devices placed underwater and to cut the wires that hold those devices anchored to the sea floor so they float up to the surface and can be disarmed. And they also train seals to patrol harbors and look for invading divers or swimmers who should not be there. What the seals are then trained to do is attach a little radio-controlled device to the back of the diver. Then they grab the diver and they drag them into the harbor where they can be surfaced and arrested by the Navy. And again, animal training using these operant and classical conditioning techniques are extremely powerful and extremely effective. You can actually see some of this stuff in action if you've ever seen a trained dolphin show or a trained seal show. Usually good aquariums will have things like this where you can go and watch the trainers work with the dolphins, and they always have a bucket of fish next to them, kind of like the guy in this boat with his seal has right next to him, because that's the positive reinforcement that they are using to train these complicated behaviors into these animals. Now, remember what I said earlier about B.F. Skinner, the guy who kind of cooked a lot of these ideas up? Skinner very, very deeply believed that positive reinforcement was more effective than punishment. So he believed in just focusing on positive reinforcers and when it came to rewarding good behavior. And if you observe bad behavior, you just don't respond to it. You ignore it. You do not reinforce it, and you really give a lot of attention to positive behaviors. Now, that might give you mixed results if you're using it in a parenting situation, but it is extremely useful when it comes to training animals, especially dogs. Dogs do an excellent job and really take to training that focuses on positive reinforcement instead of relying on any form of punishment. Negative punishment or omission training, where you kind of put the dog in a kennel for a little bit of time and ignore it if it does something bad, is a good technique to use. Again, you're not using any actual pain or punishment there, or positive punishment there, but really using positive reinforcement and just ignoring bad behavior is a good process to apply when you were training dogs. You can actually see this in television shows like It's Me or the Dog or The Dog Whisperer. He's a master of using these techniques. I think that is it for this video. Next, we're going to move on to observational learning. I will see you in the 4th video for Chapter 6.